Emily had moved into the old apartment on Ashwood Lane, expecting charm, quiet, and the comfort of a fresh start. But what she found instead was a presence she couldn't see and a voice she couldn't ignore. The first night felt normal enough. The building's creaking floors and faint, drafty whispers of wind seemed like part of its character, nothing more. But on the third night, just as the clock struck 2:42 a.m., she froze awake. There it was, her name, spoken softly, deliberately, echoing from somewhere in the apartment. Emily. The sound curled around her like smoke, intimate and unnerving, impossible to ignore. Her pulse raced, a cold shiver sliding down her spine, and every rational explanation failed. This wasn't the pipes, it wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a dream. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, heart hammering in her chest, and shone her phone's flashlight into the living room. The apartment looked empty, silent, and completely normal, yet the whisper returned, closer now, almost teasing, making her doubt her own senses. By the fifth night, subtle changes began to terrify her more than the voice itself. The bedroom door was always slightly ajar. The hallway shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally toward her, and the faintest hint of movement passed through the corners of her eyes when she wasn't looking. Determined to prove herself sane, Emily set up cameras in every room, recording the nights in hopes of capturing something tangible. But every morning, the footage showed nothing, no figures, no movements, no explanation. And yet, when she played the audio recordings, her name was there, whispered again, unmistakable, in that same intimate, horrifying tone. It wasn't a prank, and it wasn't random. The apartment itself seemed alive, aware, testing her attention, and making her realize with a creeping dread that the voice wasn't calling her for comfort. It was calling her because it knew her, because it wanted her to notice, and because it had been waiting. That night, Emily sat rigid in her bed as 2:42 approached, heart hammering like a drum, and the whisper came again, closer, almost behind her. Her blood ran cold as the chilling realization sank in. This wasn't just an old apartment with creaking floors. It was alive, and it knew her name. By the sixth night, Emily could no longer pretend that the whispers were harmless or imagined. Every creak, every sigh of the old apartment seemed deliberate, timed perfectly to keep her on edge. The soft voice that had once whispered her name from somewhere in the empty room now began to shift, almost imperceptibly, as if testing boundaries. At first, she thought she heard it in the kitchen, then the hallway, then in the shadows at the foot of her bed, always soft, always deliberate. Emily. She started to follow it, walking slowly through the dim apartment with her phone flashlight cutting through the darkness, her heart hammering in a rhythm that matched the growing fear curling in her chest. Shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally in response to her movements, and objects she swore were in one place were slightly shifted when she returned. The cameras she had set up offered no comfort. Each morning, she would review hours of footage showing empty rooms, silent hallways, and nothing out of the ordinary, but the audio played back her name over and over, whispering with a clarity that made her stomach turn. Then the subtle changes became impossible to ignore. The bedroom door creaked open on its own. The air grew colder near the corners of the rooms, and the shadows seemed to lean closer whenever she looked away. One night, she even thought she saw movement at the edge of the living room light, fleeting glimpses of a form that melted into the darkness whenever she blinked. Emily began leaving small notes on the floor, hoping to catch whatever it was, marking spots where she thought it might appear. But the next morning, the notes had moved, rearranged as if some unseen intelligence was playing with her. Fear was no longer just a sensation. It was tangible, wrapping around her like a vice, forcing her to notice every subtle sound, every flicker of light, every shift of air. And then it escalated further. One night, the whisper responded when she spoke. Tentatively, she called out, "Who's there?" And the voice answered softly, chillingly, as if from inside her own mind. "I'm always here, watching. The words were not just heard, they were felt, vibrating through her chest, pressing into her brain, impossible to ignore. Emily realized in a sudden terrifying clarity that she was no longer just a tenant in this apartment. She was a participant in something alive, something patient, something that had been waiting for her to notice. And the whisper wasn't just calling her name anymore, it was claiming her attention, drawing her deeper into the apartment's growing influence, where silence itself had become more terrifying than the voice. By the 8th night, Emily's sense of reality was fraying. The whispers that once floated softly through empty rooms had grown bolder, forming patterns she could almost recognize, almost anticipate, as if the apartment itself was learning her rhythms. It wasn't just her name anymore. Now it echoed phrases, short sentences, a voice that seemed to imitate her own thoughts. "Don't leave, stay with me." The shadows responded to her movements, stretching impossibly long along the walls, coiling around corners like black smoke, as if the darkness itself were alive. Objects began to shift with purpose. A chair in the kitchen facing the wall, one moment would face the doorway, the next. Picture frames tilted at angles she hadn't left them. Doors that she distinctly remembered locking were found slightly ajar in the morning. Emily tried reasoning with herself, reminding herself she was alone, that it was all in her mind, that the building was old and full of quirks, but the subtle pressure against her consciousness told her otherwise. One night, as she lay in bed, paralyzed by fear, the whisper came from multiple directions at once, circling her. "Emily, I'm here. Don't hide." The temperature dropped so suddenly that her breath came out in visible puffs, and the faint hum of the apartment's old pipes was drowned out by a low, guttural vibration that seemed to resonate in the floorboards beneath her. She reached for her phone to check the cameras again, hoping for reassurance, but the screens flickered and went black, then returned showing nothing: empty rooms, frozen furniture, silence, but the audio played over her name endlessly. Panic set in. She could no longer move freely, feeling the very walls press closer with every sound she made. Then, as if crossing some invisible threshold, she saw it at the edge of her vision, a dark shape, just beyond the hallway light. Elongated and faceless, coiling around the corner before melting into shadow. Emily's hands shook as she pointed her flashlight, but the beam caught nothing. The entity wasn't physical yet, but the intelligence behind it was unmistakable, aware of her, testing her. That night, she whispered her own name aloud, almost instinctively, and the voice responded instantly, eerily calm. "I know you." The apartment wasn't just haunted. It was alive, sentient, and Emily realized with a growing horror that her every movement, every thought, every fear had been observed, cataloged, and toyed with. The whispers weren't just calling her name. They were drawing her deeper into a nightmare where silence had teeth. Shadows had awareness, and the house itself had begun to breathe around her, waiting for her to surrender completely. By the 10th night, Emily could no longer deny the truth. The apartment was alive, aware, and it had chosen her. The whispers had evolved from simple calls of her name into sentences that mirrored her fears and desires, taunting her, drawing her attention like a predator guiding prey. "You shouldn't hide, come closer." They murmured from every corner, from behind walls, even from the floorboards beneath her feet. Shadows began to take form, writhing along the edges of the room, twisting unnaturally, and the temperature dropped in pockets around the apartment, as if something cold breathed near her. Objects moved on their own books, sliding off shelves, doors slamming, chairs tilting with impossible precision, and sometimes Emily swore she could feel a faint pressure on her shoulders, as if invisible hands were brushing against her. She tried reasoning with herself, convincing herself to leave, to escape, but every exit seemed to stretch further, corridors elongating, hallways twisting, until the apartment no longer felt like a real place but a labyrinth designed to trap her. One night, as the clock neared 2:42 a.m., Emily sat trembling on the edge of her bed, when a low, guttural whisper echoed directly behind her ear. "I've been waiting." She spun around, flashlight slicing through the darkness, revealing nothing, but the shadows in the corners were thicker, more defined, pulsing like living smoke. Then, for the first time, she saw movement, dark shapes that didn't belong to any human form, stretching impossibly, faceless and fluid, slinking along the walls and ceiling in impossible ways as if testing her reactions. Panic overwhelmed her, but the entity wasn't violent yet. It was patient, intelligent, observing her terror with a cruel, silent satisfaction. Her cameras continued to show nothing, empty rooms, undisturbed furniture, but every audio recording confirmed the impossible. Whispers, low and deliberate, that knew her every fear, every thought. The apartment's awareness had grown, feeding on her anxiety, learning how to manipulate her senses, warping reality around her. Emily realized that she wasn't just haunted. She was being hunted in a psychological game where perception itself was the trap. And then, as a shadow slowly coiled at the far edge of the room, the whisper came again, close enough that she could feel it vibrate in her chest. "Emily, you can't leave, not yet." The apartment had crossed the line from observer to participant, and Emily understood with a bone-deep chill that the haunting wasn't merely for fear. It was a preparation, a calling, a silent insistence that she was now part of something ancient, malevolent, and waiting for her surrender. By the 12th night, Emily's life had become a waking nightmare. The apartment no longer waited for her to notice. It demanded her attention. The whispers had grown confident, almost conversational, repeating her name in tones that shifted between soothing, mocking, and menacing. "Emily, why do you hide?" "I'm here." Always. The shadows had begun to move with intent, stretching across the floor and curling around the furniture, forming shapes that resembled limbs, faceless figures, and distorted human forms that seemed to watch her every movement. Objects flew from one side of the apartment to another without explanation. Picture frames shattered against walls. Bookshelves trembled and toppled, and the furniture shifted in ways that made it impossible for her to know where to stand safely. One night, as Emily tried to leave, she found the hallway extending endlessly, the door to the outside gone, replaced by a wall of darkness that seemed to pulse with the apartment's awareness. Her cameras showed empty rooms, yet the audio captured whispers from every corner, circling her, echoing in impossible directions. "You can't leave, Emily. I've waited too long." Then it began mimicking her own voice, calling back her thoughts, repeating her fears aloud, making her doubt her own mind. Shadows began pressing against her, not physically, but with a weight she could feel, pushing her to the ground, crowding her into corners, surrounding her in a cage of darkness and dread. One particularly terrifying moment, she sat in the living room clutching her knees when a soft tap sounded on the wall directly behind her. Trembling, she turned, and the whisper came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You belong here, with me." The realization hit her like ice. This was no ordinary haunting. The apartment wasn't just sentient. It was possessive, alive in ways that defied reason, and it had chosen her as its permanent resident. The walls themselves seemed to pulse in rhythm with her racing heart, and the shadows coalesced into a darker, denser presence that pressed in with every breath she took. Emily understood, with a bone-deep terror, that resistance was futile. This wasn't about scaring her. It was about ownership, about drawing her entirely into the apartment's world, where the whispers would never stop, where the shadows would never let her escape, and where every corner of the house watched, waited, and whispered her name, until she surrendered completely. The boundary between reality and nightmare had vanished. Emily was no longer alone, and the apartment's voice, calm and deliberate, whispered in her ear, closer than ever, "Welcome home, Emily. You can't leave." By the 14th night, Emily's fear had become a living, breathing presence inside her chest. The whispers no longer waited, they dominated. Every time she blinked, shadows stretched unnaturally, curling along the walls like smoke with intent. "Emily, look at me. Don't hide." The voice now followed her through the apartment, echoing in empty rooms, crawling under doors, seeping through cracks in the floors. Objects moved violently. Chairs toppled over, glass shattered. The floorboards groaned under invisible weight. And sometimes she swore the walls themselves were breathing in rhythm with her terror. She tried to escape, but the hallway twisted and stretched as if the apartment had become a labyrinth designed to trap her permanently. Her cameras no longer provided solace. Their screens flickered with static and shadows that weren't there when she looked in the room, while the audio recorded whispers repeating everything she thought. Every doubt, every fear, every word she whispered aloud. Then came the physical pressure. She felt fingers, invisible but undeniable, tracing her shoulders, brushing her hair, tugging at her arms, nudging her into corners, reminding her that she was no longer alone. The whisper evolved further, almost intelligent, speaking not just her name but her deepest fears. "You cannot leave. You cannot hide. You are mine." Panic consumed her as she realized the apartment had crossed from haunting to control, and every movement she made, every breath she took, was observed, catalogued, manipulated. One night, trapped in the bedroom, she saw a shadow detach itself from the far wall, a dark, faceless figure that pulsed like liquid, moving impossibly fast across the room, wrapping around her as if testing the limits of her fear. Her screams echoed through the apartment but found no exit. The walls absorbed them. The whisper came from inside her mind, inside her very bones. "You belong here, Emily. Forever." Emily sank to the floor, trembling, her sanity fraying at the edges. The apartment wasn't just alive, it had claimed her entirely, turning her own home into a cage of darkness. And sound where shadows watched, whispers breathed, and silence itself had teeth. She realized then, with a bone-deep horror, that she was no longer the observer of the haunting. She was part of it. The apartment didn't want her to leave. It wanted her to vanish into its world, to become one with the whispers and the shadows, forever responding to its call, forever hearing her name spoken in that chilling, intimate voice that had haunted her from the very beginning. By the 15th night, Emily was a shadow of herself, her every waking thought consumed by the apartment and its whispers. The once familiar rooms had transformed into a labyrinth of dread, the walls bending and stretching unnaturally, doors leading nowhere, and hallways spiraling into darkness that seemed alive. The voice had grown bolder, no longer content with whispering her name from the shadows. It now spoke directly into her mind, threading itself into her thoughts. "Emily, you cannot hide. I am part of you now." The shadows coalesced into forms, vaguely human but faceless, slithering across walls and floors with fluid, impossible movements, pressing against her senses with a weight she could feel but not see. Objects flew violently across rooms, bookshelves toppled, and the temperature plummeted to freezing pockets, each gust of cold air carrying the unmistakable whisper of her name. Terrified yet desperate, Emily confronted the apartment, screaming aloud for it to leave, for it to stop, for her life to be hers again, but the voice only laughed softly, intimately, and echoed back, "You cannot leave. You are mine. Always." It began to manipulate her perception, making her feel shrinking. The ceiling descending, walls closing in, shadows taller, longer, thicker. Then, in the living room, she saw the final manifestation. A dark, fluid, faceless figure rising from the shadows, moving impossibly fast, stretching across the room, its presence pressing into her chest with every heartbeat. Emily tried to flee, but her legs felt like lead, her body trapped in the gravity of fear itself. The whispers now layered on top of one another, calling her name from every conceivable angle, inside her head and outside, vibrating in her bones. "Emily, you belong here. Forever." Her mind teetered on the edge of collapse, reality and nightmare blurring. She realized, with utter horror, that the apartment had claimed her, not as a tenant, not as a guest, but as a permanent inhabitant of its darkness, part of its shadows and whispers. Her screams dissolved into the void, absorbed by the walls, as the faceless figure advanced and the whispers wrapped around her consciousness like chains. And in the final moment, Emily understood that this was no haunting she could escape. The apartment wasn't just sentient, it was eternal, and she had become part of its world. The whispering voice inside the empty room forever calling her name, claiming her in a way that even death could not undo. In the quiet aftermath, Emily no longer recognized herself or the apartment. The once cozy rooms were now a shifting, sentient maze, shadows stretching endlessly, corners curling impossibly, and every surface seeming to pulse with the presence that had claimed her. The whispers no longer waited. They were constant, insidious, threading into her very thoughts. "Emily, you are mine, forever." Her reflection in mirrors showed her own face, but pale, hollow-eyed, and flickering like a shadow of herself. Every attempt to leave was met with distortion. The doors led only to more darkness. Hallways stretched infinitely, and the city outside became unreachable, as if the apartment had severed her from the world. Objects continued to move with purpose, books shattering, lights flickering, the floors creaking in rhythm with the whispers. Emily's mind teetered on the edge of sanity, the weight of the apartment's awareness pressing into her chest until each breath was a struggle. And then, in the living room, she saw it fully. The shadow that had stalked her for nights, faceless and fluid, stretching impossibly, coiling around her like smoke with consciousness of its own. She realized in a final, bone-deep moment of terror that the apartment had never been haunted. It had been alive, waiting for someone to notice, someone to acknowledge it, someone to belong. And she had. The whispers grew louder, echoing in her head, in her bones, vibrating in perfect unison with the walls. "Emily, you will never leave. You are part of me. Always." Emily sank to the floor, unable to resist, and the shadows enveloped her entirely. In that instant, the apartment was complete. It had claimed its inhabitant, merging fear, presence, and reality into one eternal, inescapable darkness. And somewhere, deep in the corners of the empty room, her name continued to echo, whispered endlessly, a chilling testament that some places are alive, patient, and forever waiting. Some things are not meant to be seen, and some names are never meant to be whispered. But for Emily, the apartment didn't just watch, it claimed her, proving that the quietest rooms often hold the loudest horrors. If you think you're alone tonight, remember, you might not be.